to welcome everybody back from your placements last week. I've got around a few tables and just had a very brief discussion about the placements. I hope you enjoyed the experience of visiting a special school, perhaps an alternative provision, maybe shadowing a Senko for the week, maybe going on more than one placement, maybe managing to pack in 3 different provisions in the 1 week. So I'm really excited that you had that opportunity. You've had now a chance to reflect on the placements and catch up with colleagues in the room that have been on various other placements. And it's all about thinking about how much some of those practices, aspects of pedagogy, behaviour management, whatever that might be, its various different guises and different forms, are applicable to your mainstream context. There may be some of you in the room that might be considering a career change. It might be, in fact, that you think, I might be thinking about pursuing a career in SEN maybe, and I would highly recommend that career choice. That's what I've done for the majority of my career, and then moving now into higher education. It's not true that you have to do your NQT year in a mainstream school. Okay, so you can go directly into special schools and have your NQT year supported just as well in special schools. And actually, colleagues in special schools, head teachers and so on, really like employing NQTs because then you get the opportunity to learn about the different approaches that you might see in special school provisions that might be quite different to mainstream provisions. So we're thinking today about keeping the individual at the heart of the provision. And I've got responsibility for doing the clicking this morning because we can't reach it from over there. You've met me, so I'm not going to bore you with any details other than to say I'm really pleased that we've got the opportunity to do this inclusion stuff. I think it's really good that we've got that opportunity. And I'll leave an introduction then to Max J. Green.
Yeah, so I'm Max. I was a former student of John's and I actually have got Asperger's, OCD, ADHD and epilepsy. So John's got all of these fancy little accomplishments and I just put all my conditions just to counterbalance.
I think that's a nice little balance.
It just makes me look a bit, alright.
What was the phrase you used the other day?
I said that John is qualified, I'm experienced.
That's probably fair enough. That's fair enough. Okay, so what we're going to begin by recognising again is that the children and young people that you've worked with the last the last week, and you'll see these children in every classroom that you work in. Some are deemed to be vulnerable. Now we can unpick the rest. We spend the rest of the day unpicking the word vulnerability because I think actually that's really context dependent. It's often dependent on what's happening in schools and all that kind of stuff. But Professor Barry Carpenter, who I've recommended you have a look up at another time, recognises that the generation that we're working with today are particularly vulnerable for a whole number of different reasons, okay? And there's a huge number of different labels and diverse needs in our school context and so on. And it's our quest really, I think, as teachers and educators, to try and make these children and young people emotionally strong. We had a really clear focus in the last session around emotional well-being. That's thinking about our own emotional well-being and also supporting the well-being of our children and young people. So Max is going to give a brief overview then of some experiences around schooling, and that's how we're going to flow through the session today. So we're going to reflect on some examples of schooling, and then if you want to interrupt and ask some questions, please do. Anything arises in terms of questions, write them down on that piece of paper. Start by thinking about what helped you in maybe primary schools then.
So you can see in primary school on the left, I didn't have the most trendiest of looks. I really tried to copy my look off Recess with TJ.
It looks quite cool.
Well, yeah, but I mean in primary school, I couldn't talk till I was 6, so my diagnosis happened around the age of 4, so I had an educational health and care plan before I went into primary. But around the time of going into primary, I still think that obviously autism, and later on I got diagnosed with the OCD and ADHD. And I found while I was at primary school there was a really kind of lack of understanding, even to the point where my mum was trying to get a diagnosis for me. The teacher, my mum said, I think he's got autism, and the teacher said he's not got autism, he's just naughty. And this was at a point as well where the Autism Act wasn't even in. So I think that we were still making, incredible steps to kind of understand the condition. And I think currently there's a lot of awareness, but there's still not enough understanding. You say to someone what is autism, and they go, oh, is that the thing where people can't look you in the eye and they don't really understand how other people feel? And it's a bit like, well, as you know, when you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that's where it can become hard. And I found that very much in school, to the point where, for instance, even socialising was hard for me, because you've got someone that can't speak, and I'm seeing everyone play football, and me being me, I'm like, oh, I want to get involved, I want to play football. And I'm running in the middle of the football pitch, and I'm picking the ball up and just running with it, because I don't even know how to play football.
Different game, man.
Yeah. So I've got loads of kids just looking at me going, what are you doing? And that, can then cause the bullying and the frustration from them. As well as, still to this day, I don't feel that, there's a lot taught in schools, particular subjects, and there's been those subjects for years on years, but there's not enough coverage on, okay, we have someone with autism in the class, getting that understanding out. And I probably had about 3 teachers that, really understood autism at school, and there was probably a majority of teachers that didn't. My reading wasn't great. I learnt number bonds to 10, I think, when I was in year 6, so just about to leave school really, and I, didn't really know my number bonds to 10 or how to read. Then going into a mainstream secondary school potentially, and having that pressure was quite difficult.
Can you think about sort of specific things that helped around the sort of social and emotional aspects, or friendship, things like that might have been helpful?
Yes, so I found what happened was, with the football, was 2 mates took me aside, and they actually showed me how to play football. I think they recognised, they picked up that, that I wasn't understanding it, and I wasn't just running in the middle of the pitch to disrupt something. I generally wanted to join in, and I think if you've got people around you like that are willing to come up to you and say, do you want to learn how to do that? That was really helpful. I had a lovely TA in probably year 3 and to year 4, and she was just lovely. She recognised that my reading wasn't great, that I needed a lot more, I suppose, attention, to learn, and that's where she got me involved in things like toe by toe. And also just taking me out the classroom, because she realised that my biggest fear with reading was they used to go around the classroom and they go, right, you read a line, you read a line. And when it came to me, I had a book in my hands that I couldn't really read. Yeah. And that, if anything, made me not want to go to the classroom, made me not want to, make friends, because then I'd be embarrassed when they laugh at me at this eventual point where I have to read something. Yeah. So she recognised that, so then she took me out of the classroom. She not only recognised that, okay, he's not a good reader, but he's not going to read if he's not reading something he enjoys. So that's when she used my interests to get me involved in something that I wanted to find the end of. I wanted to read the book because I wanted to find out. And what it was like fairy tales, but with a twist. So instead of Cinderella, it was Cinder Boy and how he wanted to go to the World Cup. And it was like the 3, instead of the 3 little pigs and the big bad wolf, it was the big bad pig and the 3 little wolves.
Okay.
And yeah, they were like builders and stuff, and they construction company, and I just found it really, really interesting. And then other interests came in. She realised that I loved games, and I remember with the number bonds to 10, she had, and honestly, I wish I could remember the game fully because I'd sell it. I've got it on market now. But it was like a card with like a house, and then a card with a car. And if, for instance, the house one had 7 and the car one had 3, they would, that would be a pair. Yeah. And it was like almost number bonds to 10 mixed with Snap.
Quite visual as well.
And memory. Because you'd have to remember where the cards were. You go, oh, I remember where that is. And she really kind of used that. And, it's things like, if it's a house and a house, it doesn't match. If it's a car and a car, it doesn't. So not only she was trying to get me to memorise where they were, but she was also working on the numbers bonds to 10 and memorising them. And then she moved it forward. Yeah. I think the best teacher I had, though, was a teacher in year 5. And she realised that I was very anxious, I was I was going through a tough time with friends at this point anyway, because I'd gone from being on like the football and finally learning, and anyway I had a football kick to my face, and it caused like me to have like a really bad nosebleed, and then it scared me from playing football again. And I lost a lot of my mates because of that. You know, mates that I kind of was developing had automatically kind of gone because of that experience. And she realised I was quite recluse, she realised I worried a lot, she realised that in any means necessary I was probably behind everyone else. And then my TA had eventually sadly left, so it was a new TA, new adjustment, and it was a big change, you know, and that is always tough. But the best thing that she done was she gave me like my own desk, and she said, I want you to bring some photos in that remind you of good things. So I brought some photos in, I stuck them on the wall, and then if someone said, you know, why's Max got a different desk, she would openly sit down, you know, with cooperation of my mum as well, you know, and say why that is, you know, and she'd be happy to have that conversation.
From my perspective, that's a really simple, reasonable adjustment, isn't it? It's nothing, doesn't cost any money, it's, you know, in response to the individual's need, and it's quite a simple, free strategy to, you know, maybe help reduce some of that anxiety and ensure that you're included in the classroom context.
And I think a lot of teachers are scared to do something like that because obviously the whole kind of teaching premise is you have to treat everybody the same, which I don't really agree with. I think that everyone needs to be held accountable, responsible for their actions at the same level, but I think you have to support people individually and differently. Otherwise, you know, some people might be here in a different level and someone might be here, but that person could be here in that level. So it's about supporting them in the way that they need to. A classic example I always use, which makes people laugh, is I don't speak to my nan how I speak to my friends. You know, I wouldn't say to my nan, let's go out clubbing, because I don't treat my nan like that. You know, it's let's put EastEnders on and have, you know, have a nice drink or something. You know, and that's the kind of example I use. Is, you know, it's not treating my nan differently to them, but it's just different. It's different socialisation. It's different approach.
Yeah, and in the code of practice, you know, the SDMD code of practice, there's a phrase in there which is doing something that's additional to and different from. So things that are additional to what's happening in the mainstream classroom, additional to and different from is your differentiation. It's very clear on a statutory perspective about how to make those kind of reasonable adjustments. And what you're trying to do there is remove the barriers to learning. You know, that's a really key phrase. You're removing something that might be a barrier to ensure inclusion. And I think that's really important to recognise that kind of, you know, some of those situations in a school context around anxiety. So how else did she support you around the anxiety side?
So she gave me a green box and she said, if you ever worry about something, I want you to write it in the box, and I want you to visualise that you're writing it, you know, you're grabbing it from your mind, you're writing it, and you're putting it in the box and it's gone. So you're almost transferring that into there. She said, you know, if you want to talk about it at the end of the day, you can. If you don't want to, we can throw it in the bin. But once we throw it in the bin, those thoughts are gone. You know, and we're at peace. If you want to leave it in the box, because it's still a concern, leave it in the box. And what it taught me was actually how much unnecessarily worrying I was doing. You know, it'd be over what I felt was big things at the time, and reading them at the end of the day, you'll be like, why was I worried about that? Yeah, I made up with him, or I made up with her, you know.
I was worried because I didn't think so-and-so liked me, or
about that book I was going to read, and now I'm not worried anymore. One classic example was there was a talent show, and this was before I had this box, and this was how worried I was. But we entered this talent show, and the CD got jammed, and it got stuck on the same point, so we couldn't finish the song. And it was on a voting system, you know, the students would vote who they wanted to see through, a bit like X Factor, really. It was better than X Factor.
Of course it was.
And I didn't think we'd get through, and that made me not want to go to the lesson, it made me not want to know, you know, my life is over, I'm out of, you know, Got Talent.
Tragic.
Tragic times, you know, I was gutted, and the PE teacher who ran it literally pulled me aside. He was like, look, you're through, all right? We counted the votes, you're through. Just go to lesson, please. And I was like, right, but literally it took that kind of, again, he saw how it was affecting me, and he was able to kind of know what would, and unfortunately that was literally, you have to give him the result, otherwise he's just gonna not want to do anything. But if I had that box,
Yes.
I'd have been able to write it down, forget about it,
Yeah.
and then have that kind of management there. And the best thing as well is when I first joined the school, I couldn't speak, and I would often, my mum, bless her, my mum is probably my hero. I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for my mum and how she's brought me up and how she's kind of taught me and everything. But literally, the connection I had with my mum, because I couldn't speak, I had to learn Macintosh, but I literally could say to my mum, and my nan would be like, what's he want? Oh, he wants a biscuit. And that would be it. The connection I had with my mum was there. But when I went to school, it was like, how do we know if he's all right? Because he can't tell us.
Yeah.
And literally, no word of a lie. I always remember, I had loads of teachers just, again, thinking, how are we gonna know? And my PE teacher just came up and he said, simple solution. And the teachers were like, what? He was like, Max, how are you doing? We having one of them today or one of them?
Yeah.
And I went, he's all right.
Very simple tactics.
Simple thing,
Yeah.
but sometimes we can overthink. What do we get him to? Oh, but his writing's not good. Can we?
Yeah.
Literally a fun. That was all. It was all it was.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a number of speakers previously on the sort of inclusion conference we had on the Friday, talk about the importance of communication. Okay, Macaton's one example, for example. There might be children that communicate in other different ways, but that's a really key. Amjad, really talked about the importance of language that we use, the way we structure our instructions, all that kind of stuff. So I think the idea about language and communication is really important. Anything else you want to reflect on about what was really helpful in primary school?
I think the thing with primary school as well is it's a time in my life where I go, oh, I wish I could go back, and I never thought I'd say that. I remember being at primary school and saying to my dad, oh, I can't wait to leave, and then my dad's like, you wait, and I'm like, it'll be fine, and then you suddenly leave and you're like, oh, But I felt like the talent show really brought me out and Michelle quite a lot. It's kind of the first thing that I felt that I was good at. I'm terrible now. Maybe I was terrible back then, I don't know. No video evidence to prove it. But I mean, that really brought me out in the shower, and it made me make friends. It made me feel more, confident about everything. So, that really helped. And I know the school probably again wasn't quite, because they didn't get a great rating with the education side of stuff. But I feel it was a good time in my life. Again, I had a good 3 teachers that understood, that helped me get through that school, and that was a good kind of stepping point for me.
What kind of things that didn't help? What kind of things didn't help so much in primary school?
So unfortunately, even though there was a good level of good, there was probably a bigger deal of things that didn't help. I remember, for instance, when I joined year 6, it was a different teacher. I went from teacher was. I went to a teacher in year 6, and it was the one I had the green box with. So I remember going into a new class, getting the green box, sitting at my desk and having it there. And I remember just walking out the room, going to lunch or something. I can't remember specifically, but all I remember is the year 6 teacher coming out of the classroom with my box, and she said, you won't be needing this anymore, will you? And before I could even answer, she literally went back in and threw it in the bin. And that was the kind of lack of understanding from her point of view. She probably thought year 6 is old enough now, doesn't really need it, And if anything, I did. It helped me actually manage the day-to-day struggles that I was having.
Yeah.
Again, I think throughout the school, it was just a lack of acknowledgement from teachers, especially from my mum. When you know that there's something, I'm not going to say not quite right because it's not a correct phrase, but when you know something's just, there's something there, and you want that, I suppose, clarity, and you want that direction to go forward with a diagnosis, and you've got teachers going, no, he's just naughty, you know, I don't really believe anyone's naughty. I think people do naughty actions, but there's always a reason and a justification behind them.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's not, you know, if it's really evil, but even to those extents, you know, there's still, I believe, a psychological explanation of why something has happened.
Yeah, we often use the phrase, don't we? All behaviour is a form of communication, or all behaviour is communicating something. I think that's really important to recognise. Just on that point there, we've got such an important role in terms of the assessment process for a whole range of different special education needs. Again, the code of practice is really useful, but certainly it's getting harder and harder now to get things like education, health and care plans. And our responsibility as teachers, again, is to really begin that process of early identification. So Max's mother was, really supportive of the school and the kind of interest in trying to seek some additional support for Max. We're the ones that have to, keep that evidence in the school setting. Code of practice, again, what's called the graduated approach. So if you can remember things like assess, plan, do, review, it's a cycle. It's very clear that our role is to do the kind of initial assessments in the school. We can plan to do some interventions, we put them into place. After a certain amount of time, we're going to review those interventions. We put them into place, we review them, and that kind of cycle repeats itself. Assess, plan, do, review. Constantly keeping the evidence. The record keeping is really important, and I think that's really important to recognise. I'm just going to pause there. At this stage, has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask Max about the primary school context? Things that might be helpful, things that perhaps weren't helpful, anything you like at this stage? Yeah.
I was just going to ask, with regards to the assessment of that cycle you were talking about, is there where would we find the framework? Is there for the paperwork? Is there specific?
Yeah, so, again, download the code of practice. It's 293 pages long, but you don't need all of it. So you can look at the primary section in there. It's got the 4 broad categories of needs. So we've got social, emotional, and mental health. We've got cognition and learning. We've got physical and sensory needs, and we've got communication interaction. So those 4 broad areas of need are what all the different types of labels that you're going to come across in schools fit under. They don't fit very comfortably in those categories, and there's some debate about whether the categories are actually as useful as they could be. For example, Max has a primary need of autism, but a number of additional needs as well. So autism often comes with comorbid conditions like ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, all kinds of other additional needs. But
What would ODD is another one?
ODD, oppositional defiance, yeah. So you can find a load of labels in there, that's really useful. But if you look at every local authority that you eventually go and work in will have what's called a local offer. And Oxfordshire County Council has a really good section around the SEN, SEN information. And one of the documents in there, doesn't matter what year group you're working in, you can look at the broad area of need, let's say SEMH for example, and it breaks down that graduated approach into the assess, what you can do in terms of assessment, the different assessments that are available, the assess, the plan, what you're doing in terms of the planning, and actual data keeping, the doing, what you're actually going to do, and that might be universal approaches at whole school level or whole class level, it might be group work, it could be individual targeted interventions, and then the review as well, what you do around the review. Dr. David Colley, who you'll be meeting this afternoon, is also going to remind you of some of this stuff, and he'll be talking much more about social and emotional aspects of learning as well. So there's various different assessments depending on the type of need that might be exhibited. We're not psychologists, so we can't clinically diagnose any kind of conditions, but we can start the journey, and we're a really important part of that process. So that's a really good question, thank you. Any other questions you might have? Yes, thank you.
Max, when you're in sort of years 5 and 6, in the classroom environment specifically, I understand you have your own desk, but did you learn from your other classmates in group activity, or were you kind of kept separate?
With group activities, I was always involved, but there was always like the TA there, because I think at the same time it was important for them to keep me in the class as much as possible, but only take me out when needed, so with the reading, they knew that I was really not confident in just reading to the class, so things like that they would take me out. But I remember, I'm quite chatty anyway, I think once I started talking I wouldn't shut up, so and sometimes I'm not saying I laid the group aside, because I probably did, but I think for them it was always important for me to be involved in those conversations, even if I did contribute enough, because sometimes I just didn't have the knowledge or to contribute as much as what I wanted to. And I always remember, like, when we were doing the Highwayman, we would constantly have group discussions about what we think this meant and what do we think this meant. And coming from someone that couldn't speak till 6, I'm just happy knowing the story, let alone how the words are perceived. So my friends would just go at it. Well, maybe he means philosophy is the answer to. And I'll be like,
Deep.
he got to A to B. That's all I care
On a
about.
horse.
So, but I mean, they would frequently get me involved, and I think there was even a day where I was writing on my book, and I was getting to the end of the page, and again, me being me, I just squeezed all the writing in I could, and someone was sat next to me, and they couldn't fathom, why I didn't just turn the page and continue writing on there. And in my mind, it was because it was a continuous string of that. It needed to be on the same page, and I didn't feel anyone would understand if it went on to the next. So he literally just slightly came over and he wrote on my book PTO, and I thought, PTO, like what's that mean? And he went, please turn over, and I went, oh, okay. So, and that was just an example of like where I learned from someone through being in that group activity.
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, I would say at primary school, even though there was bullying and there was times where it wasn't nice, and a lot of the bullying actually happened outside of the school rather than in. The majority of people are actually quite kind and actually quite, I wouldn't say they wanted to be friends with me, but they knew I was different, and they didn't ever really pick on that inside school. I mean, there was a bunch of people that did outside, but my friendship group that I did have at school, probably near the end, I mean, they never really, to them I was just Max near the end, and that was quite nice. And I think that was what was tough going from primary school to secondary school, because when I made that transition, because I had an educational health and care plan, the government got to pick what school they advised I should go to. So all my mates went up to the school up the road, all these people I'd made friends with. It took me 6 years to make friends with them. And now I'm going to this new environment, this new place, and it's kind of, starting a new life again.
Yeah.
So that was quite tricky. But I mean, group activities, I'd say a lot of the time, again, I think it was that understanding as well. They really knew that I was probably behind in learning, but social aspect, they probably didn't actually have a good idea of how socially aware and how socialising I was with other people.
Yeah, really important. Good question.
In my eyes, what makes a good school, what makes a good teacher? I mean, I think throughout the schools I went to, just to explain a bit further, when I went to the secondary school, I went to a ASD unit at the school. And I had the conversation with you probably the other week, but as soon as I kind of went to the school, I realised I wasn't going to enjoy it. It probably wasn't the right place for me. But again, my mum, it's the only, it's the school that's probably going to help you the best, and I went, and it just felt to me that slowly after time, there was a lot of people with conditions, but all of them would slowly be ushered out of the ASD unit. And it just seemed to me that they wanted people with conditions who didn't need a lot of additional help, so I think my first year there, I probably saw about 8 people get kicked out. And we're bearing in mind here, this is an ASD unit.
Specialist unit.
This is a unit that's meant to be specialised in supporting these people with conditions and supporting them. And 8 people gone. And it wasn't a great year, because it started off, my granddad died, and I had to make all these new friends, and then, truth to be known, I tried to be somebody I wasn't, because I wanted to make friends. So then I tried to kind of be this kind of runaway rogue, and kind of up to mischief all the time, not going to lessons, always seen absconding, and I just really wanted people to like me. And it was tough, because it was a new environment. You know, I'm from the country. These guys are in the middle of a town. They're speaking all this different, you know, kind of language and lingo, and I'm out, you know, in the kind of, and simple things as well that really kind of made it hard for me was when I joined the school. I said, you know, I know I'm going to need help, but I didn't want a TA to sit right next to me in a mainstream school, because I knew from that point, as soon as they sat next to me, the whole of the class would know that I've got something wrong.
You need some additional support.
And I knew it's almost like painting a target on your back and going, you know, we've got something now. And I just didn't want that. I felt I had enough, you know what I mean? You know,
Backwards egg cat.
you know, glass, I don't need any more. So I just, you know, said, I'm going to need help, but is there any way you could kind of do the helicopter approach, which is, you know, you just go around the class and, you know, you know that you're going to need to help me more, but don't make it so obvious. And they kind of went, yeah, you know, not a problem. First lesson, you know, they sat next to me, and it was kind of game over, you know, because that's your tutor, and you know, that's your peer group, and that's who you're going to go to the lessons with, and that was, that was difficult. So yeah, you know, before long they put me on a reduced timetable, and then sadly, you know, I was one of the other individuals that then got ushered out of the school, and it was, you know, it was a tough time, because as I say, I just wanted to be liked, and you know, in the end I realised that I wasn't really being liked for me. I was kind of being liked for this kind of fake facade I put on, and you know, that was what they liked, really.
I mean, I think something that's really powerful there is the idea about a sense of belonging in a school. You know, that actually you feel connected to the young people that you're around, you connect with the adults that are working with you, connect to the environment. You know, people actually listen when a young person says, look, you know, what's going to be really helpful? What's going to be really helpful is if I don't have a TA Velcro to me all day, and that we actually are able to respond to that. You know, our children are young people, and parents are actually the expert in these conditions. You know, we're there to support the idea of, you know, about inclusion, which I'm 100% behind. But that inclusion has to be, you know, there's a whole number of complex ways that we can achieve inclusion, and some of them are really kind of much more relational, for example. It's about the quality of the relationships and all that kind of stuff. What about qualities of a good teacher then? What do you think about qualities of a good teacher?
Qualities of a good teacher, I always say to any teachers that I speak to, any of the speaking events, I say, the true quality of a good teacher is you don't have to understand everything about the condition. All you really need to understand is how that condition affects that individual. So say you meet one person, someone with autism might not be able to be on a stage and speak. At the same token, I'm terrible with maths. Terrible. Would not want me doing your books. You'd be in court instantly. But I know many people with autism that are brilliant with that, and they could just, you give them a book, they'd be done with it in, you know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. So if you understand that about the individual, you understand that they're not going to be able to talk, they're not going to be, you know, and it's just really key things like that. What would have really helped me in school is I always forgot things. I was rubbish at bringing books and bringing pens, and that was a big transition for me going from primary to secondary, because it's all expected. You know, you go to secondary, you're meant to bring your pens, you're meant to bring your books. I wasn't good at that, and there was so much lack of communication between the main school and the secondary unit. Not only the main school didn't really know I had a condition until they saw me with a TA, but even if they saw me with a TA, because there was an LSU unit and an ASD unit, they didn't know what condition I had, they didn't know what affected me. So one day I came in without a TA, again because of time and timetables, and sometimes, you know, it's so far, you know, pulled together, you know, you can't be everywhere at once. No. And one day I had to go to a lesson without a TA, and I forgot my book and my pens. He just went, right, out you go. And again, it's such a simple thing that could have been avoided, you know, give me a spare book and I'll start using that as my, or anything like that. And it was just instantly out, and it's so much lack of communication.
Well, just on that note as well, you know, you've probably seen in the news recently, there was a big conference on Friday called Ban the Booths. You might have, if you're on social media, you might have seen that. around, but there's quite a lot of concerns currently about these kind of zero tolerance, no excuses around behaviour. I mean, you know, there are various ways of understanding behaviour management. I don't like the phrase behaviour management, but this is an example where an individual with additional needs then is punished for an aspect of their condition, you know, around, you know, being, I don't know, forgetting bits of equipment and so on, and being instantly then either put in detention or sent out of the classroom and all that kind of stuff, which just feeds into that sense of potential anxiety and difficulties around, you know, the educational experience, really.
The biggest lack of communication was one day I just wanted to go to a lesson without a TA. And this day I brought my books and I brought my pens, and it's quite a funny story. Anyway, teachers didn't know where I was. I didn't let them know where I was. I literally just ran off and they didn't know where I was.
But you were going to a classroom to learn?
I was.
Independently?
Independently.
With the right equipment?
Because I just wanted to be in a lesson once without a TA, you know, and that might sound bad, but I just felt so kind of suffocated. I just wanted to be me for once. Anyway, they've rang my dad. They've said, we can't find him. He's missing. My dad's driving up and down the road trying to find me. Literally, they're this close to calling like the police.
Yeah, because no one knows where I am.
And literally, they've had to ring my dad up because they've just thought, oh, maybe
He's absconded.
he's in his lesson.
Oh.
So they checked the lesson and I was in there. So they've had to ring my dad up and go, oh yeah, you know your son who's missing? Yeah, he's in his class.
Getting on with his work.
Getting
on with his work.
Getting on with his work.
Oh.
So yeah, and again, that was that biggest miscommunication. But you know, if that teacher had any kind of communication with the ASD unit, they would have knew where I was. And it's just that lack of communication that actually really, and I don't know, maybe it's statistics, maybe they wanted a lot of their students to go on and get GCSEs and this and GCSEs and that in the ASD unit, and maybe they wanted to get rid of the people that they felt weren't capable of doing it. And that's another quality that makes a good teacher, is don't give up on them.
No.
You know, the biggest thing with John's school was John is, you know, he was my former teacher. So when I got kicked out of my secondary school, I had to go to what I thought was an autistic school, which was very much kind of, would be fair to say, misrepresented, really.
It was a school for pupils, so it was a very broad category of needs, and it was around communication difficulties and essentially challenging behaviour. So specific learning difficulties, communication difficulties and challenging behaviour. So we had a whole way. You look at the code of practice, you look at the kind of SEMH category, it was every kind of specific need you might have. So there wasn't really a balance of children with autism and a balance with those children that might have experienced early trauma. So a whole range, all the kind of labels that you could think of in one school environment. But this is now at an independent special school level. So having been in mainstream, then in a specialist unit, Max then came to an independent special school. And at the time, quite a small number of children, maybe about 20 odd when you first arrived. So I remember the interview for Max. He came very smart, he was ready to engage in his learning, all that kind of stuff. And at the time that I knew Max, I never heard Max swear, actually. We had a very behaviourist approach to what you call behaviour management, which I'm not really that in favour of, but the young people could earn 5 points per lesson. You might have seen this on placements, 5 points per lesson. Each point meant a penny. And so by the end of the week, you could earn, how much was it?
£2.25.
£2.25 at the end of the week. Max still remembers. And what could happen then is that you would bank your money and you could save it up. And at the end of the week, there were 3 different colour-coded levels. Green was the higher level, which meant the young people could go off-site, and so we would go to Castown Stadium, we'd go to the golf course, we'd go into town, spend some money. Amber would be just below that stage, but then
Just on-site.
on-site activities, so you could go and play football for the afternoon, you could do some crafts or baking or
They even done car washing.
car washing to earn a bit of extra money, yeah. So that, and as deputy head of the school, I was often working with the students on red status, and red status was the kind of catch-up work they might have missed during the week and so on. And so, so Max, as far as I'm aware, in the 3 or 4 years that I knew you, well, was only not awarded 1 point, I think. Is that right? in the
But I
whole
was
time.
rewarded that. That's a
He
funny
has been
story.
rewarded that point recently.
That
But
point
so-
was rewarded about 6 years later.
About 6 years later, at a recent conference, I've never forgotten this because Max was quite obsessed by the system.
I would say I'm quite a perfectionist.
Very much a perfectionist, which again has its dangers really around having to perform at a high level.
Sets you up for failure.
And so having to work so hard in every lesson, and I'm sure Max will share, it wasn't at times the easiest environment to work with, because there were children with a huge range of other complex needs. Not all the children there wanted to engage in their learning all of the time, and so Max being in a year 9 class with maybe two other autistic children, but 3 or 4 that were out of county referrals from the London boroughs, and so actually were engaged regularly in kind of gang culture and all kinds of other really challenging experiences around their kind of context really. This was a day school, so the children would come in every day in a taxi, some up to an hour, some up to an hour and a half. So from Reading, Brent, Harrow, and again all these children, Banbury, rough area of Banbury. But I mean these are all children that have a right to an education.
Tough out.
Down in the ghettos, these children all had a right to an education. And we had, the opportunities to support these children and young people. They've been excluded from, again, mainstream, pupil referral units, local authority special schools, academy special schools, homeschooling, reduced timetables. Some children have been out of education for 3 years, been excluded in year 7, and not come back into the education system. So trying to, if you like, reintegrate children back into education was quite complex at times. So at times a really challenging environment to teach in, a challenging environment to learn in. Some have had experiences like that possibly in the last week. So a very different context. And what I would say about something I shared with you before is the whole school SEND document is freely downloadable. I shared it with you last time. And there's a whole section there about transitions, and Max has shared some really relevant stuff there about just transition from primary into secondary, from secondary into a different provision, maybe from lesson to lesson. All those kind of stuff have a huge impact, I think. What was positive about that school and the independent special school?
Well, they answer those 2 questions. Yeah, that school was a good school. Now, not because of the teachers, and nowhere near because of the teachers. The education wasn't as probably good as what it could have been, but that's not because the teachers didn't try and teach us. It's not because the teachers just gave up and didn't want it. It was strictly because of the environment that we was in. I mean, we were talking my first week, I had teachers look at me in shock, as in to say, why are you here? And I kind of didn't grasp the concept, well, why aren't I? And at this point, I just wanted to get on with learning, and to be fair, it was probably too late.
No, never too late.
But that's kind of how it felt at that time. It was probably too late for me to do that, because the school didn't offer GCSEs at the time either, which I know that you were very kind of heavily wanted to push, people getting that, but at the same time, I know that you were very understanding, is it fair for us to set them up for that?
It's a tricky one, because again, with the sort of accreditation angle, every course or every experience you had was accredited, but not necessarily at GCSE level. And Max is going to move forward in the next few minutes thinking about what he's doing now. And one of the things around having an education in a more specialist provision is what employers look at afterwards. And so Max might have come out with a number of different courses, but not a B in GCSE maths. So that's the employability angle there, which is worth thinking about now, I think, really, isn't it?
Just quickly though, I mean, again, what makes a good teacher? John, from my eyes, and probably Bob March, all the guys there were brilliant teachers, because these teachers got punched, they got kicked, they got spat at, they had to...
Not by Max, I will say. Never.
Not by me, no.
Never by Max.
And they had to sadly positively handle some of the students, because they've become a danger not only to themselves but to other people. And I just sometimes used to think, why are you here? Like, why did you come back in the next day? You were punched yesterday, you were kicked,
Why?
And it just made me feel that if these guys are coming in and they're not giving up on me, then why should I give up on myself or give up what potentially I could have. So, that to me is what makes a good school. Education was really kind of irrelevant because the support that the school gave to every individual was, you couldn't get it anywhere else. And what makes a good teacher? Somebody that listens, somebody that understands you as an individual, and somebody that's not going to give up and go, look, you're going to punch me, you're going to kick me, I don't care. I'm here because you've got potential, you can do well, and that's what we're focusing on.
Well, just again, go from a more theoretical perspective here, I don't know if you get to write assignments around behaviour management or whatever that is, that's a very specific approach to working with children that might engage in behaviours that challenge us, and Max has given a few examples there of the kind of behaviours that might have been exhibited. But I think what we're thinking about there is this kind of idea about unconditional positive regard. Some of these children, for example, Max and I agree that behaviour is communicating something. And a lot of these children actually, were at really high levels of distress. High levels of distress in the home context before they've arrived at school, high levels of distress on the way into school, high levels of distress around engagement in learning, high levels of distress around interacting with others. And we have to recognise that actually those behaviours we need to understand. The idea about the tip of the iceberg, what we see as the observable behaviour, actually what's going on underneath it is hugely important to recognise. And if you haven't come across an organisation called Beacon House, I would highly recommend Beacon House, particularly around trauma-informed practice, because there's loads and loads of really useful resources there. Again, you'll hear about attachment-aware schools, you'll hear about trauma-informed practice, you'll hear about nurture group approaches. These are very different ways of working, and they offer actually a real opposition to the guidance that you'll read in policy documents. So again, if you've got the time at some point, download and have a read of the policy that gives an overview of your statutory responsibilities around behaviour and discipline in schools. You all have the powers to discipline children. You all have the powers to discipline children beyond the school gate. So what happens outside school, you've got the powers to give Saturday detentions if you want to. You've got a whole hierarchy of sanctions that you can go beyond a sort of firm teacher look into, fixed term exclusions up to 45 days in a year, permanent exclusions. The government at the moment are really keen on recommending more punitive approaches. Now what that leads to is a huge increase in the number of children being excluded from our schools. Those children that have the highest representation in exclusion statistics are children with special educational needs. If you look at the characteristics of other excluded children and young people, they're children that experience multiple vulnerabilities or are exposed to multiple risks in their childhood. And so really it's a different way of thinking about behaviour. It's a kind of philosophy that underpins your approach, and you'll be developing that over time. And we certainly had a non-exclusion policy, so no matter what happened at the school, we didn't exclude children. It was very much about recognising capability and strengths rather than deficits. Yes, we had a huge range of complex labels in the school, but actually it was about meeting the children's needs. Welcoming the children on arrival, having breakfast together, playing a game of cards in the morning before we moved into any kind of teaching activities.
The best thing though was this, and I heard this at a conference last week. These guys put up with people getting punched, kicked, spat, all of that, right? Never kicked out. Conference that we had last week, Simon Knight, who was speaking, brilliant guy, just so intelligent. Yeah. He told a story about how a student got kicked out for doing this. Every lesson, she had to do that. Yeah. And it was just because she needed a rhythm, she needed a behavioural pattern to learn. And the simple solution to that was, because he was having a conversation with her, and he said, well, you haven't done that all lesson. And she was doing this behind her desk with her foot. And that gave the same, behavioural repeating thing that she needed to learn. Yeah. So all those schools kicked her out, but really they could have just went, well, let's try some, and it just boggles me that a school, where people get punched and kicked and all that, and they don't give up on the pupils, but then you've got a school that goes, oh no, that's too much. Well, that's where we draw the line.
Well, sadly, within the behaviour policies, a sanction, a consequence or a punishment can happen for any behaviour that interrupts the learning of others. You know, that could be seen as an interruption to the teaching, it could be an interruption to the learning and so on. We're going to have to fast forward rapidly now. After our school, we worked together, and I'll just share that Max was chairman of the school council for 3 years running. Very impressive accolade, and kept getting voted in. Made some significant changes to the school environment. What's the first thing you
Mirrors.
asked for?
The school didn't have mirrors, so I got rid of the cap and I started styling my hair. And went in first day, no mirrors. So I went, right, something's got to happen here.
Yes.
It's like Trump with his wall, but mirrors.
Yeah, mirrors in every.
We're going to build mirrors. We're going to make the school great.
Yeah, and it worked. So yeah, he got his mirrors. We ended up with a bike track. We ended up with all sorts of really interesting tuck shops, you know, all sorts of interesting stuff. Max then went to college. I'll fast forward through this bit. Didn't really enjoy college so much. Lost quite a lot of additional support. I want to move on to what you're doing now, if I may.
Yeah.
Because since then, Max has developed, you know, a career in acting, for example. I'd like to maybe share a bit about your acting career. You might recognise Max, in fact. What have you been in over
I
the
feel like Troy McClure.
yeah,
right?
hold on, you
Simpsons.
may recognise Max from.
So I've been on Holby City Doctors. I've been on The Right Stuff, BBC Breakfast, and also done adverts for Santander and Ford. Most of my roles are actually of raising awareness with autism. But at first, I mean, my acting was just, I sat at home and I said, you know, I really want to do that. And I just thought, well, you know, get off your bum and do it. So, you know, that's kind of where I kind of went with it, really.
You've been in a film here?
Yeah, I've done a short film last year called Crippled Karma, which was about an individual who gets attacked, and the video then goes viral online. And it's almost a kind of big dream sequence of him plotting kind of revenge, and I play like a doctor who told him about the diagnosis, and now I'm kind of helping him seek revenge.
So. Ooh, interesting. And I'm very honoured to know Max, because Max regularly invites me up to the House of Parliament with him. Do you want to share why you were involved with the House of Parliament?
So I mean, when I left school, I mean, I didn't have any GCSEs. I just had the you know, functional skills and all of that, and it was quite worrying times. It's like, well, what am I going to do with my life? So I persevered, I rang people, I just really went with it, and you know, I got, you know, my apprenticeship that took me 3 years, took me 7 times to pass maths, then won Apprentice of the Year, then got the film roles. But then there was a time in my life where John had got back in touch with me, and he said, I've seen you on like Holby, oh my God, you know.
Yeah.
And John said there's a role that the Autism Society are doing, and it was about employment in work, because at the moment there's only 16% of people with autism in full-time work, and that hasn't changed for 10 years. That's even since the Autism Act came in.
Shockingly low statistics.
Yeah. So John said, oh, I think you should go for the role, and I did, and I got it, and then since then I've had a lot of speaking events, and I do a lot of speeches up in Parliament. And I find that Parliament often do live life through tinted glasses. They don't really understand, you know, the extremeness of the situation. You know, the fact that they're cutting, you know, budget from schools. The fact that there's only, you know, there's 16% of people with autism in full-time work. That wasn't a number that they done, that they researched. That was from the Autism Society. So I regularly ambassador for them now, and also do independent speeches on my own, just to kind of raise the awareness about employment. And I've gone through tough employment myself.
You've got bits of paper on the table. If you haven't thought to write a question, maybe you'd like to now. Just while you're writing your questions, do anybody else have any questions for Max? I'm conscious of time. I'd like to give people the opportunity to ask Max any questions you like, because it's probably the last time you'll meet Max, but do ask any questions.
We don't answer any today. I've done a video last year where I just answered them all on my YouTube channel.
Yeah, just a question.
I'm really interested in what you have to say about parental involvement.
Yeah.
Because I'd just like to find out about how when the boy announcing the attendant after the disabled. And that meant that we together went involved with the parents. And it was more of a two-way communication. And we go on to college and we did very well. Have you ever
Yeah, so I mean, I went to a conference the other day, and it was literally, it was just two parents, you know, and they think that their children might be on the spectrum, one's just getting diagnosed, and it was really handy for them to have that conversation. But I truly believe that parents are probably the most untapped resource when it comes to conditions and disabilities and everything, because I've always said it, no one's going to understand my autism as much as myself, but the one person who's ever going to be close to that is my mum, because not only I've lived it, but she has. My mum often says, she goes, normally your children grow up with you, but I've had to grow up with him. And I think that's such a powerful quote, because she has, you know. I remember when they wanted to go out, you know, it would be like 2 weeks advance for me. You know, you're not going out. What do you mean you're going out now? No. I need to know like 2 weeks. And you know, it's very odd, kind of complex, odd relationship. Why am I letting my child know 2 weeks before I'm going out? What? But
Transitions, yeah.
It's that relationship, and it's that knowing, and not a lot of places have that. Especially, I had played a role once when I was on Doctors. That I was being interviewed by like a policeman, and one of the lines always stuck to me. The policeman said to me in the lines, he was like, "Oi, are you listening to me?" And my so-called dad in the script was, "Just because he's not looking at you doesn't mean he's not listening." So it's just things like that, that if you don't know, a parent can really be involved in that process, and sometimes I hate to say it, but sometimes your parents know you better than you know yourself. You know, sometimes I've gone into a situation and I think that won't bother me, and then when it happens, it does, and my mum goes, "I told you it'd bother you." But you don't listen, you know. So again, they're the most untapped resource, and I think if you have that sit down with a parent and you can have that open discussion, it will only better, you know, the person with autism's life, their curriculum, everything, you know, going forward. And I often say in my YouTube videos, I think it's very important that we get it right at the first step. Because I feel if we can't get it right here, it's just a downward spiral, and it's very hard to pick that up, because if you go through the education system always being, you know, feeling down, feeling isolated, you know, it's very hard. Again, when you met me, it could have been very hard to pick me up and go, I know all these other places have let you down, but we're not. And that, you know, I feel if we get it right from the get-go, it just really helps.
Right, a very influential head teacher that we both worked with once said it's not the children that have failed schools, it's the schools that have failed the children. You know, I think that's really important. Might have time for one more question, and then I can see you're desperate for lunch. We've got 3 workshops this afternoon. Any other? Oh, go on. Who not? This is about, so I mean, again, yeah. I mean, the idea around the Children and Families Act was about bringing education, health and social care together. You know, the Code of Practice, the first time it's ever been published with the Department for Education and the Department of Health. But I think it really is really important to recognise that there are still problematic elements around bringing together education, health and social care. And I think if you are interested in reading more about that, there has just been a recent review about the introduction of the SEND Code of Practice that is actually really critical of the introduction, the implementation of what was advertised as being the biggest reform in 30 odd years. It's still parents having to fight battles, it's still children and young people waiting, you know, a ridiculous amount of time for any kind of professional support, and you know, that is a real concern, I think. So,
I think surveys by the National Autism Society suggest that there's probably more awareness, but not enough understanding. There's a lack of understanding. Survey done, it's like, have you heard of autism? Yeah. Do you know what it is? Not really. No. With Parliament as well, when I sat and we were kind of celebrating the Autism Act, there was a big part of me that was actually sat in there thinking, what are we celebrating? You know, exclusions are bigger than ever. You know, 16% of people in full-time work, that's still not changed. You know, the average diagnosis age is still 4, which is still what it was then.
so much later.
So it is a bit like, well, what have we actually improved on in that time? I know that's kind of a negative way to look at it, but those are things that I really work with. So one of the things that I done was I wanted the apprenticeship scheme to be a more inclusive way of getting people in jobs with conditions. And one of the problems I had, which was I had to take my maths level 2 7 times. I had level 1, but I work in IT, I never use maths, but I still needed it to pass my MBQ. So one of the things that was introduced in the green paper was, instead of it being level 2 now, you only need level 1. So they've reduced the, you know, the actual qualification, you know, so to get more people in work. Yeah. And again, you know, these things are great, but then you kind of hear things as well, like one of the Conservative MPs turned around and said people who have disabilities shouldn't be paid as much because they don't know how to handle their money. So it's like, you know, you get one place, you know, of progression, and it only takes one person to say something so stupid to bring it back again. So yeah,
I'm going to leave with that one. I'm going to advise that a whole room of educators actually become slightly more non-conformist in the way that you work with children and young people. Don't always do things because people tell you this is the way we've always done it. You know, head teacher says do it this way, the government says do it that way. Be the teachers that break the rules. Be the teachers that do something different for these children and young people. Connect with the families, connect with the young people, get to know them, and that's how I think you're going to make changes. But I'm going to, you know, please join me in thanking Max for his contribution today. Thank you very much.